The cantina was dark and smoky. Commander Zexathala sat in the corner booth, his forearms wrapped around a large glass of Thanix wine. The blue liquid glowed softly in the dim light. Across from him sat a young reporter named Kira, her recording device blinking red on the table between them. "You want to know about the humans," Zexathala said slowly. His voice was deep and tired. "Everyone wants to know about the humans these days. 50 years since the war ended, and people still ask the same questions." Kira leaned forward. "The galaxy needs to understand what happened during those years. Your experiences could help explain why the war changed everything." Zexathala laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Changed everything? Child, you have no idea. Before we met the humans, war was simple. Armies met in space. Ships fired at each other until one side had more losses than they could accept. Then, the losing side would surrender or retreat. Clean, professional, reasonable." He took a long drink of wine. "The humans taught us that war could be something else entirely, something that keeps you awake at night for decades." The old commander's eyes went distant. "It started on Kepler 442b jungle world, hot, humid, full of dangerous plants and animals. We needed to take the planet to secure our supply lines. Intelligence said there was only a small human garrison there. Maybe 200 soldiers at most." Kira's stylus moved quickly across her tablet. "What made this battle different?" "Everything," Zexathala said. "But I did not know that at first. My fleet carried 12,000 soldiers. We had air support, heavy weapons, and orbital bombardment capabilities. The humans had what looked like a basic defensive position around their main base." He paused, remembering. "Standard military doctrine said we should offer them terms. Let them surrender with honor, save lives on both sides. So I sent a message to their commander." "What did they say?" "Nothing. No response at all. So we began our attack. We hit their outer defenses with orbital strikes, destroyed their communications array, took out their supply depot. Everything by the book." Zexathala's expression darkened. "That is when we learned that humans do not read the same books we do." The reporter waited quietly as the old soldier gathered his thoughts. "The main assault began at dawn. My ground forces moved in 3 columns toward their base. We expected to find confused, demoralized soldiers ready to surrender. Instead, we found empty trenches and abandoned positions." "They had retreated?" "No. They had moved, repositioned, turned the entire jungle into a weapon." Zexathala's voice grew quiet. "The humans had spent weeks preparing. They had dug tunnels everywhere, set traps, created hidden firing positions. They knew we would come, and they had planned for it." He drank more wine. "But that was not the worst part. The worst part was what we found at Hill 347. Kira looked up from her notes. "Hill 347? A small rise in the jungle, maybe 50 meters high. It controlled the main road to their base. 37 humans were dug in there under the command of a sergeant named Danny Rodriguez. We needed that hill to continue our advance." Zexathala's 4 hands trembled slightly. "I thought it would take a few hours to capture, maybe a day at most. Standard attack formation, overwhelming firepower. The humans would see they were outnumbered and surrender. But they didn't. No, they did not." The commander's voice was barely a whisper now. "They fought like nothing I had ever seen. We attacked with 500 soldiers. They held us off. We brought in artillery. They dug deeper. We called in airstrikes. They built better cover." Kira could see the pain in the old alien's eyes. "How long did the battle last?" 17 days. Zexathala said the words like a curse. 17 days of constant fighting. We threw everything we had at that hill. Rockets, plasma cannons, chemical weapons. Nothing worked. Every time we thought we had them beaten, they would counterattack," the reporter wrote furiously. "What were the casualties?" "On our side, nearly 2,000 killed or wounded. We lost 43 aircraft, dozens of armored vehicles. An entire regiment was decimated trying to take that one small hill. And the humans? Zexthala was quiet for a long moment. On day 17, we finally broke through their lines. When we reached the top of the hill, we found 3 humans still alive. 3 out of 37. Rodriguez was one of them. The old commander's voice shook. He was lying in a crater, bleeding from multiple wounds. His left arm was broken. He had shrapnel in his chest. He had not eaten real food in over a week. But when our medics reached him, do you know what he said? Kira shook her head. He looked up at me with those human eyes and said, "Sir, we are ready to hold this position for another week if needed." The cantina was silent except for the hum of the air recyclers. Zexthala stared into his wine glass. That was when I understood. These humans were not fighting the same war we were. They were not trying to win territory or achieve objectives. They were fighting because they had decided to fight. Nothing else mattered. Kira looked up from her notes. What happened to Rodriguez? We gave him medical treatment, prisoner of war protocols. But he kept asking about his men, the dead ones. He wanted to know if we would bury them properly, if we would send messages to their families. He was more concerned about his dead soldiers than his own wounds. Zexthala finished his wine and signaled for another. I had been fighting wars for 30 years before I met the humans. I thought I understood what soldiers were, what they could do, what they would do. I was wrong. How? So, normal soldiers fight until they cannot win. Then they surrender or retreat. It is logical, it saves lives, it makes sense. The commander's new drink arrived, and he immediately took a large swallow. Human soldiers fight until they cannot fight. There is a difference. The reporter frowned. I do not understand. On that hill we found humans who had continued fighting with broken bones, infected wounds, empty stomachs, no ammunition. They had made weapons from pieces of metal and rock. They had been drinking rainwater and eating tree bark. Several had died from their wounds but had been propped up in firing positions to make us think they were still alive. Zexthala's voice grew distant. Rodriguez told me later that they had discussed surrender on day 12. They had a vote. The vote was 37-0 against surrender, not because they thought they could win. They knew they were going to die. They voted to keep fighting anyway. Why? That is what I asked Rodriguez. He looked at me like I was stupid. Because we are soldiers, sir. This is what we do. The old commander shook his head slowly. I realized then that we were not fighting an army. We were fighting a species that had turned warfare into a form of religion. They did not fight for territory or resources or political goals. They fought because they had decided that fighting was the right thing to do. Kira stopped writing. That must have been terrifying. It was. But it was also the beginning. Hill 347 was just the first lesson. Over the next 4 years, the humans taught us many more things about war, things that still wake me up at night. The reporter looked at her notes. What happened to the rest of the human garrison on Kepler 442b? Zexthala smiled grimly. We eventually took the planet, but it cost us 8 months and nearly half our invasion force. And that was just one small world with 200 human soldiers. He raised his glass in a mock toast. To the humans. They lost every major battle but somehow made us feel like we were the ones being defeated. The cantina grew quiet again as both beings contemplated the implications of that statement. Outside, the trading station hummed with the business of a dozen different species, all of them living in a galaxy forever changed by humanity's refusal to accept defeat. Tell me about the next battle, Kira said softly. Zexthala nodded slowly. The ghost ship incident, that one was even worse. Zexthala ordered another drink and leaned back in his chair. The cantina was getting busier as the station's night shift began. Alien voices mixed together in a dozen different languages, but the commander's attention was focused on memories. From long ago, the ghost ship, he said slowly. 6 months after Kepler 442b, my fleet was patrolling the Vega system. We had learned to be more careful around human positions, more respectful of their capabilities, but this time we thought luck was on our side. Kira adjusted her recording device. What did you find? A human ship drifting in space. No power signatures, no life signs, no communications. It looked like a standard light cruiser that had been badly damaged in battle. The kind of wreck we had seen dozens of times before. The old commander's eyes grew distant. My intelligence officer identified it as the Defiance, commanded by Captain Lisa Monroe. According to our records, the ship had been crippled in battle 3 weeks earlier. All crew presumed dead or evacuated. But you were suspicious? Not at first. It looked exactly like what it appeared to be, a dead ship floating in space. But something felt wrong. The damage was too clean, too precise, like it had been arranged. Zexathala took a drink. My fleet had 8 heavy cruisers and dozens of smaller vessels. This single human ship posed no threat even if it was operational. So I decided to board it. Salvage operations. Maybe we could learn something about human technology. The reporter made notes. Standard procedure? Yes. We sent 3 boarding parties, 60 soldiers total. The ship's airlocks were damaged, so we had to cut through the hull. Everything seemed normal. Too normal. The commander paused, remembering. The first team entered through the engine section. They found exactly what they expected. Dead engines, ruptured fuel lines, blast damage from weapons fire. The second team went through the cargo holds, again nothing unusual. Scattered supplies, some battle damage, a few bodies. Where was the third team? Command section. That was my team. I wanted to see the bridge myself, maybe find their computer cores or communication logs. Zexathala's voice dropped to a whisper. The corridors were dark, emergency lighting only. Our scanner showed no life, signs anywhere on the ship. But I started to notice small things. The bodies we found were positioned strangely. The damage seemed too convenient, like someone had arranged everything. Kira leaned forward. What kind of arrangements? Bodies near doorways where they would be seen immediately. Blast damage that blocked some passages but left others open. Equipment failures that looked accidental but created perfect ambush points. The old soldier's hands shook slightly. I was starting to understand. This was not a dead ship. This was a trap. But by then, it was too late. What happened? We reached the bridge. It was dark except for a few flickering displays. I could see a figure in the captain's chair. At first I thought it was another body. Then she spoke. Zexathala closed his eyes. Captain Lisa Monroe. She had been sitting in that chair for 3 weeks, waiting. Her ship was dying around her, but she was still at her post, the reporter wrote quickly. She was alive? Barely. She was wearing an environmental suit because life support had failed days earlier. She was surviving on emergency rations and recycled water. She looked like she had lost 30 pounds, but her voice was steady when she spoke to me. What did she say? Welcome aboard the Defiance, Commander. I have been expecting you. The cantina noise faded as Zexathala continued his story. That was when I realized how badly we had been fooled. This was not a salvage operation. This was an elaborate ambush that had taken weeks to prepare. Kira looked confused. But you said there were no life signs. Monroe and her crew had been living in environmental suits for 3 weeks. They had rerouted power from life support to create false readings on our scanners. They had positioned the bodies of their dead crewmates to make us think the ship was abandoned. The commander shook his head in amazement. 17 humans had survived the original battle. Instead of trying to escape or calling for rescue, they had decided to turn their dying ship into a weapon. How is that possible? They had prepared for this exact scenario. Monroe told me later that human ships carried supplies for extended covert operations, not because they expected to win battles like this, but because they might have opportunities to cause damage even after losing. Zexathala's voice grew quiet. For 3 weeks they had been patient. They had programmed their computers to send fake distress signals. They had created false heat signatures to make the ship look abandoned. They had even pumped gases into certain sections to mimic the smell of death. The reporter stopped writing. They planned all of this while their ship was dying. Yes, while they were slowly running out of air and food. while their friends were dying around them, while they had no hope of rescue or survival. The commander's voice was filled with something between respect and horror. They used that time to plan the perfect trap. What happened when you realized it was an ambush? Monroe smiled at me. I will never forget that smile. She was dying. Her ship was falling apart. She had not eaten a real meal in weeks, but she smiled like she had just won the greatest victory in galactic history. Zexathala drank deeply. She pressed a button on her command chair. Suddenly, the ship came alive. Hidden weapons activated. Blast doors sealed. Emergency systems that had been shut down for weeks suddenly powered up. They attacked? Not immediately. First, Monroe wanted to talk. She wanted me to understand what was about to happen. The old commander's voice shook. She explained how they had spent 3 weeks preparing, how they had tested every system, how they had calculated exactly how much damage they could cause. The reporter waited quietly. Then she told me about her crew. 17 people who had volunteered to stay behind and die for this one chance. An engineer who had rigged the reactor to overload. A weapons officer who had turned their remaining ammunition into makeshift bombs. A medic who had been keeping everyone alive just long enough to complete the mission. Zexathala looked directly at Kira. Do you understand what that means? 17 humans had chosen to die slowly over 3 weeks for the chance to damage my fleet. Not to escape, not to win, just to hurt us before they died. What was going through your mind? Terror. Pure terror. Not because of the immediate danger, but because I was starting to understand what we were really fighting. The commander's voice was barely audible. These were not soldiers in any conventional sense. These were fanatics who had made warfare into a form of art. Did you try to escape? Of course, but Monroe had planned for that too. The ship's artificial gravity had been modified to make movement difficult. The corridors we had used to enter were now sealed or blocked. Every exit had been turned into a kill zone. Zexathala paused. But the worst part was Monroe herself. She sat in that captain's chair like she was hosting a dinner party. She asked about my family, my career, my plans after the war, like we were old friends having a conversation. While planning to kill you? While dying herself. She was running, on stimulants and sheer willpower. Her environmental suit was leaking. Her hands were shaking from malnutrition, but she kept talking like everything was normal. The reporter looked up from her notes. What did she want? To explain. She wanted me to understand that this was not personal. She respected me as a professional soldier, but she had a job to do, and she was going to do it properly. Zexthala's voice grew softer. She told me about her crew, how young they were, how they had families back on Earth, how they had all voted to stay behind and turn the ship into a trap, not because they hated us, but because it was their duty. How did the ambush work? Perfectly. When Monroe triggered the final sequence, hidden charges throughout the ship created a chain reaction. The modified reactor overloaded exactly as planned. The explosion was so powerful it destroyed 2 of my heavy cruisers and damaged 3 others. The old commander stared into his drink. 17 humans. 1 dying ship. They caused more damage to my fleet than most entire battles. Kira looked shocked. What happened to Monroe? She died at her post. When we found her body later, she was still in the captain's chair, still wearing that environmental suit, still smiling. The cantina had grown quiet around them. Other patrons seemed to sense the gravity of the story being told. There was something else, Zexathala said quietly. A message she had recorded for whoever found her body. Do you want to know what it said? The reporter nodded. Tell them we held the line. The commander's voice broke slightly. That was all. Tell them we held the line. Both beings sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Kira spoke. How did this change your understanding of human warfare? Zexathala looked up with haunted eyes. It taught me that humans do not just fight battles. They fight wars that extend beyond life and death. Monroe and her crew had been dead for weeks, but they were still fighting, still causing damage, still holding their line. He raised his glass again. To Captain Lisa Monroe and the crew of the Defiance. They showed us that human defeat could be more dangerous than human victory. The old commander finished his drink and looked at the reporter. Ready for the next story? It gets worse. The cantina was nearly empty now. Most of the evening crowd had moved on to other entertainment. Zexathala sat hunched over his third glass of wine, his forearms wrapped around himself like he was cold. The reporter Kira had been listening for hours, but she showed no signs of fatigue. Not all of my encounters with humans involved direct combat, the old commander said softly. Sometimes the most frightening things happen during what should be peaceful moments. Kira looked up from her notes. What do you mean? Proxima Station. It was a mining facility in the outer rim. Nothing special about it. Maybe 5,000 people living there. Humans had been using it as a supply depot for their fleet operations. Zexathala swirled his wine slowly. We needed to take the station, to cut off their supply lines, standard siege warfare, surround the station, cut off their communications, wait for them to surrender. Should have been simple. But it wasn't. The siege lasted 2 months. That was normal. But what happened inside the station during those 2 months changed how I think about human nature. The commander paused to collect his thoughts. The station commander was reasonable, Captain Helen Barnes. She understood military reality. When it became clear that no relief was coming, she began negotiating surrender terms. Everything was proceeding normally. Kira waited patiently. Then the asteroid field shifted. Pure bad luck. A large rock hit the station's outer ring. Massive structural damage. The medical bay was cut off from the rest of the station, sealed behind collapsed corridors and twisted metal. Zexathala's voice grew quiet. Inside that medical bay was Navy Corpsman Jake Sullivan. He had been treating wounded soldiers from both sides during the siege. Standard military courtesy. We had an agreement about medical neutrality. What happened when the section was sealed off? We expected Sullivan to try to break out, or signal for help, or at least wait for rescue teams to reach him. Instead, he did something that still confuses me. The old soldier looked directly at the reporter. He kept working. Working? The medical bay had 37 patients when the collapse happened. Human soldiers, Viridian prisoners of war, civilian miners who had been injured during the siege. Sullivan was the only medical person left alive in that section. Zexathala drank slowly. He had no way to communicate with the outside. No hope of immediate rescue. The life support systems were failing, but he continued treating patients like nothing had changed. Kira frowned. How do you know what he was doing? Security cameras. The station's monitoring system was still partially functional. We could watch what was happening in different sections. I started paying attention to the medical bay because I was curious about how humans would handle the crisis. The commander's expression grew distant. What I saw there taught me more about human nature than any battle ever could. Tell me. Sullivan worked for 6 days straight. No sleep except for 20-minute naps. No real food because he gave his rations to the patients. No help because everyone else in that section was either wounded or dead. Zexathala shook his head slowly. He performed surgery by flashlight when the power failed. He sterilized instruments with alcohol from the officers' emergency supplies. He made bandages from torn clothing. He even figured out how to jury-rig the broken life support system to keep his patients alive, the reporter wrote quickly. What about the Viridian prisoners? That was the most amazing part. Sullivan treated them exactly the same as human patients. He gave them the same level of care, the same attention, the same resources, even though they were enemy soldiers. Kira looked up. Why would he do that? I asked him that question later. His answer was simple. They were patients, sir. That's all that mattered. Zexathala's voice carried a note of wonder. On day 3, one of the Viridian prisoners died from his injuries. Sullivan spent 2 hours preparing the body according to Viridian funeral customs. 2 hours he could have used to rest or treat other patients, but he thought it was important to show respect for the dead. How did he know Viridian customs? He had been studying them during quiet moments in the siege, reading about different species' medical needs and cultural practices. just in case he ever needed to treat non-human patients properly. The commander paused. That was when I started to understand that we were not just fighting human soldiers. We were fighting human ideals. What do you mean? Sullivan was not following military orders. There was no one to give him orders. He was not trying to win a battle or achieve a strategic objective. He was just being what he thought a medic should be. Zexthala looked tired. On day 4, the ceiling started collapsing in parts of the medical bay. Standard protocol would be to evacuate to safer areas. But Sullivan refused to move his patients. Instead, he started reinforcing the damaged sections with whatever materials he could find. How? Metal bed frames became support beams. Medical equipment was repurposed into structural braces. He even used his own body weight to hold up a sagging section of ceiling while he worked on a patient underneath it. The reporter stopped writing. That sounds impossible. I watched it happen. Hour after hour, Sullivan would position himself to support part of the collapsing structure while he treated someone. His back must have been screaming in pain, but he never stopped working. Zexathala's voice grew softer. On day 5, he ran out of proper medical supplies, so he started improvising. He used electronics components to build a basic heart monitor. He made IV tubes from plastic tubing and improvised connectors. He even figured out how to purify water using the station's recycling systems. Where did he learn to do those things? He didn't. He was inventing solutions as he went along, making it up based on basic principles and desperate necessity. The old commander shook his head. But the most incredible thing was how he treated the conscious patients. He talked to them constantly, asked about their families, their homes, their hopes for after the war. He made sure they knew they were not forgotten. Kira looked up from her notes. Even the enemy soldiers? Especially the enemy soldiers. He seemed to understand that they were scared and far from home. He learned basic phrases in our language so he could comfort them. He asked about Viridian culture and customs so he could make them feel more comfortable. What happened on day 6? That was when we finally broke through to the medical bay. It took enormous effort. Cutting through twisted metal, clearing debris, rerouting around damaged sections, we expected to find chaos, death, desperation. Zexathala was quiet for a long moment. Instead, we found Sullivan at his makeshift desk, updating patient records by hand. Every single patient was alive, all 37 of them, including the Viridian prisoners. How did they look? Sullivan had lost maybe 30 pounds. His hands were shaking from exhaustion. His uniform was torn and dirty. He could barely stand without support. But when he saw us, he stood up and saluted. The commander's voice broke slightly. Then he gave us a complete medical report on every patient, their conditions, treatment plans, medication schedules, everything organized and professional, like he was handing over a shift at a normal hospital. What did he say? Just doing my job, sir. That was all. Just doing my job. Zexthala drank deeply. Later, when we were able to interview him properly, Sullivan explained his thinking. He said that being a medic was not just a military assignment. It was a promise he had made. A promise to help anyone who needed help, regardless of species or nationality. Did he expect recognition for what he did? No. He was actually confused by all the attention. He kept saying that any medic would have done the same thing. He genuinely could not understand why people thought his actions were unusual. The reporter looked shocked. He thought 6 days of improvised medicine in a collapsing building was normal. That was the most frightening part. Sullivan was not trying to be a hero. He was not making a grand gesture or proving a point. He was just being what he thought a human medic should be. Zexthala's voice grew quiet. I realized then that we were not fighting an army with unusual tactics. We were fighting a species that had different basic assumptions about what normal behavior looked like. How so? For Sullivan, abandoning patients was literally unthinkable. Not because he was brave or noble, but because it went against his fundamental understanding of what it meant to be a medic. He could no more leave those patients than he could stop breathing. The old commander stared into his glass. That level of commitment to duty, even when no one is watching, even when There is no reward, even when it might cost your life. That is not training. That is not military discipline. That is something deeper. Kira wrote silently for several minutes. Finally, she looked up. What happened to Sullivan? He was transferred back to human space as part of a prisoner exchange. But before he left, he spent 3 days training our medics on the improvised techniques he had developed. He wanted to make sure we could properly care for the patients he was leaving behind. The Viridian prisoners? Yes, he was worried about them. He made us promise to continue their treatment according to the plans he had written. He even left detailed notes about each patient's personality and preferences, so we could keep them comfortable. The cantina was almost empty now. Only a few late-night drinkers remained at the bar, their conversations muted and distant. Zexathala sat slumped in his chair, 4 empty glasses lined up in front of him. His eyes were red and tired, but his voice remained steady. Titan Base, he said quietly. That name still gives me nightmares. If you want to understand why the war changed everything, you need to hear about Titan Base. Kira looked up from her notes. Her recording device had been running for hours, but she showed no signs of stopping. What made it different? It was the last major human stronghold in the Outer Rim, a mining colony that had been converted into a military fortress. Intelligence said it held critical strategic data about human fleet movements and supply lines. Zexathala picked up his 5th glass of wine with shaking hands. Taking that base was essential for our final victory. High Command assigned me 3 full battle groups, 50,000 soldiers, orbital bombardment platforms, everything we needed for a quick, decisive assault. How many humans were defending it? 800 soldiers under Colonel Rita Hayes, plus about 200 civilians. Military families mostly, children and spouses who had not been evacuated. The old commander's voice grew quiet. We expected the siege to last maybe 2 weeks. Standard tactics: cut off supplies, destroy their defenses, offer surrender terms. Hayes was a reasonable officer. She would see the tactical situation and make the logical choice. Kira waited silently. The siege lasted 4 months and 17 days. 137 days of the most brutal warfare I have ever experienced. And the worst part was that the humans were not trying to win. They were trying to make us pay for every meter of ground. What do you mean? Hayes had been preparing for this siege for years, not months, years. She had been stockpiling supplies, building hidden defenses, training her people for extended resistance. She knew that eventual defeat was certain, but she was determined to make that defeat as costly as possible. Zexathala drank slowly. The base was built into a series of underground tunnels and reinforced bunkers. Every corridor was a potential kill zone. Every room was fortified. Every entrance was booby-trapped. Hayes had turned the entire facility into a 3-dimensional maze of death. What were the initial attacks like? Disasters. Complete disasters. We would breach an outer wall only to find 3 more walls behind it. We would capture a section only to discover it was rigged with explosives. We would corner a group of defenders only to have them vanish through hidden passages. The commander's voice grew darker, but the real horror was not the tactical situation. It was watching how the humans adapted to impossible circumstances. How so? When we cut off their water supply, they started recycling everything. When we destroyed their food storages, they began growing plants in underground gardens. When we knocked out their power generators, they rigged exercise bikes to create electricity. Zexathala looked directly at Kira. These people were not just surviving under siege conditions. They were thriving. They were treating the whole situation like an interesting problem to solve. What about the civilians? That was the most disturbing part. Hayes had not evacuated the families because they were part of her defense plan. Not as hostages or human shields, but as active participants. The reporter stopped writing. Children were fighting? Not directly. But they were contributing. 10-year-old kids were running messages through tunnels too small for adults. Teenagers were helping with equipment, maintenance, and medical care. Even the youngest children were helping with food preparation and supply management. Zexathala's voice shook. Hayes had prepared her people for this siege by making it a community effort. Everyone had a job. Everyone was essential. Everyone. understood that they were fighting for something bigger than themselves. What was their morale like? That was what kept me awake at night. They were happy, not grim or desperate or fearful. They were actually enjoying themselves. They treated the siege like a challenging game that they were determined to play better than anyone had ever played it before. The old commander paused. I remember watching through our surveillance equipment as human families gathered for dinner. In the mess halls, they would sing songs, tell jokes, celebrate birthdays and anniversaries, like they were on vacation instead of slowly dying in a hopeless military situation. How did that affect your soldiers? It was devastating for morale. My troops expected to be fighting desperate, demoralized enemies. Instead, they were facing people who seemed genuinely excited about the challenge of holding out longer than anyone thought possible. Zexathala drank again. By day 60, we had taken maybe 20% of the base. Each section cost us hundreds of casualties. Each victory was immediately countered by some new defensive innovation the humans had prepared. What kind of innovations? Hayes was a genius at improvised warfare. She had her people making weapons from mining equipment, explosives from industrial, chemicals, armor from metal plating. They turned maintenance robots into mobile gun platforms. The commander's voice grew quiet, but the worst part was how they used their knowledge of the base itself. Hayes and her people had lived there for years. They knew every pipe, every electrical conduit, every structural weakness. They used that knowledge to create traps that were perfectly adapted to our tactics. Give me an example. Day 73. We finally broke through to the main command center. It had taken us weeks of fighting to get there. We expected to find Hayes and her senior staff making their last stand. Zexathala's eyes went distant. Instead, we found a note on her desk. Welcome to Titan Base. The real command center is 3 levels down. Have a nice day. Signed with a little smiley face. They had moved? They had been using the original command center as a decoy for months. While we were focusing our attacks on what we thought was their headquarters, Hayes was actually running operations from a converted storage room that did not appear on any of our maps. The reporter looked amazed. How did you find the real command center? We didn't. They revealed it to us on day 127 when Hayes decided it was time for the final phase of her defense plan. What happened? The humans stopped trying to hold territory. Instead, they started a fighting withdrawal toward the deepest parts of the base. But this was not a panicked retreat. It was a carefully planned operation that had been rehearsed. For months. Zexathala's voice grew softer. Every step of the withdrawal was designed to cause maximum casualties while preserving as many human lives as possible. They would abandon a section only after rigging it with enough explosives to collapse the entire tunnel system. They were destroying their own base? Yes. Hayes was willing to lose everything as long as she could make us pay a terrible price for victory. By day 130, we had technically captured 90% of Titan Base. But that 90% was now a pile of rubble filled with booby traps and unexploded ordnance. The old commander looked exhausted. The final assault came on day 137. Hayes and maybe 50 survivors were holed up in the deepest bunker complex. We had them completely surrounded, no escape routes, no hope of rescue. Standard military logic said they would surrender. But they didn't. Hayes sent us a message. Just 3 words. Come and take it. Zexathala was quiet for a long moment. The final battle lasted 18 hours. 50 humans against 3,000 of my best soldiers. Room by room, corridor by corridor, they made us fight for every meter. What was Hayes like during the final battle? I spoke to her over the radio during the fighting. She was calm, professional. She asked about my family, my career plans after the war. She even gave me tactical advice about how to take the bunker more efficiently. The reporter frowned. She was helping you defeat her. She respected professional competence even in enemies. Hayes knew she was going to die, but she wanted the final battle to be fought properly, with skill and honor on both sides. Zexathala's voice broke slightly. When we finally reached the central bunker, we found Hayes at her command post. She had been mortally wounded hours earlier but had refused medical attention. She was still coordinating the defense, still giving orders, still fighting. What did she say? She looked up at me and smiled. Actually smiled. Then she said, "Good fight, Commander. You did better than I expected. Most of my people made it to the evacuation tunnels, so I consider this a tactical victory." The old commander stared into his glass. That was when I learned that the entire siege had been a diversion. While we were focused on taking the base, Hayes had been secretly evacuating hundreds of people through hidden tunnels that led to underground rivers. She had been planning the evacuation from the beginning. The whole siege was designed to give her people time to escape. Hayes never intended to hold Titan Base permanently. She just wanted to extract maximum casualties while saving as many lives as possible. Zexathala looked up with haunted eyes. Her last words were transmitted to the escaping survivors. Remember everything. Make them pay for every inch. What happened to the escapees? The cantina was completely silent now. Even the background hum of the station's systems seemed muted. Zexathala sat hunched over the table, his forearms wrapped around his final glass of wine. The liquid had long since stopped glowing, leaving only darkness between them. Kira checked her recording device one last time. "You said the final story would explain why the war really ended. I thought your people won." The old commander looked up with eyes that had seen too much. "That is what everyone believes. That is what the history books say. The Viridian Alliance achieved total military victory over human forces. We captured their major colonies. We destroyed their fleets. We forced them to sign surrender agreements." He paused, drinking slowly. "But I was there for the peace negotiations. I heard what the humans really said, and I understood that we had not won anything at all." "What do you mean?" "The war lasted 7 years. 7 years of the most brutal, costly fighting in galactic history. By the end, both sides were exhausted. We had lost over 2 billion soldiers. Entire star systems had been depopulated. The galactic economy had collapsed under the weight of total warfare." Zexathala's voice grew quiet. "My own fleet had been reduced from 12,000 ships to fewer than 300. Most of my friends were dead. My home world had been bombed so many times that nothing grew there anymore." Kira wrote silently, sensing that interrupting would break the spell of memory. But the humans were in even worse condition. Their main colonies had fallen. Their government had been scattered. Their military was reduced to scattered insurgent groups hiding in asteroid fields and dead systems. The commander looked directly at the reporter. "So when they asked for peace negotiations, we thought we had finally broken them, finally convinced them that continued resistance was hopeless. Weren't they broken?" "That is what we thought. The negotiations took place on neutral ground, a space station in the Centauri system. I was part of the Viridian delegation because of my extensive experience fighting human forces." Zexathala drank again. "The human delegation was led by Admiral Kate Bishop. I had heard of her. She had been responsible for several major human victories early in the war. A competent officer, but nothing special." "What was your first impression of the negotiations?" "Strange, very strange. We expected to be dictating surrender terms to a defeated enemy. Instead, Bishop and her people acted like they were negotiating a business deal between equals." The mime, old commander's voice carried a note of confusion that had never faded. "They did not act defeated. They did not apologize for the war. They did not beg for mercy. They sat down at that table like they had every right to be there." "What did they want?" That was the first shock. They were not asking for mercy, they were demanding territorial concessions. They wanted us to withdraw from certain systems. They wanted prisoner exchanges. They wanted guarantees about treatment of human civilians in occupied territories. Zexathala shook his head slowly. "We had just spent 7 years defeating them. We had destroyed their fleets and captured their worlds. And they were making demands like they had won the war. How did your delegation respond?" "We were confused. Our negotiator, General Vexquin, asked Bishop if she understood her situation. Did she realize that human military resistance had been crushed? Did she know that her government no longer existed?" "Me." Commander paused. Bishop smiled at that question. The same kind of smile I had seen on Captain Monroe's face all those years earlier. Then she said something that changed everything. Kira leaned forward. What did she say? She said, "General, I think there has been a misunderstanding. We have not been fighting a war, we have been conducting a field test." The reporter stopped writing. A field test? Those were her exact words. A field test, like the entire 7-year conflict had been some kind of military exercise. Sexthala's voice grew softer. Then Bishop explained what she meant. Everything we had witnessed during the war. The impossible last stands, the suicidal attacks, the refusal to surrender under any circumstances. All of that had been humans fighting under what they called peacetime rules of engagement. Peacetime rules? Rules designed to minimize human casualties and limit collateral damage. Rules that prioritize the safety of non-combatants over military efficiency. Rules that treated captured enemies according to formal protocols instead of practical necessity. The old commander looked haunted. Bishop told us that human military doctrine had 2 completely different sets of operational parameters. The rules they had been using against us were designed for conflicts with civilized opponents who shared basic assumptions about acceptable warfare. Kira felt a chill. What were the other rules? Total war protocols. Rules for fighting enemies that threatened human extinction. Rules that removed all limitations on tactics, weapons, and targets. Sexthala drank deeply. Bishop explained that the human government had never authorized total war protocols against us. Despite 7 years of brutal fighting, despite billions of casualties, despite the destruction of human colonies, their military had been operating under restricted engagement rules. Why? Because they respected us as a civilized species. Because they believed the conflict could be resolved through traditional military means. Because they thought we shared basic assumptions about how wars should be fought. The commander's voice shook. Then Bishop said something that still gives me nightmares. She said, "The real war would have started if you had actually threatened Earth itself." The cantina seemed to grow colder. Kira realized she had stopped breathing. "Do you understand what that means?" Sexthala asked quietly. "Everything I have told you tonight. Every impossible human victory. Every terrifying display of determination. Every example of them fighting, beyond the limits of sanity and reason. All of that was them holding back. Holding back? We never saw humans fighting for their survival. We never saw what they were capable of when they stopped following civilized rules of warfare. We never saw them when they decided that victory was more important than honor." The old commander stared into his glass. Bishop told us that total war protocols included tactics that human military command considered too dangerous to use against fellow civilized species, weapons that violated every galactic convention on acceptable warfare, strategies that prioritized enemy destruction over human survival. What kind of tactics? She did not give details. She just said that peacetime engagement rules assumed the enemy would eventually see reason and negotiate. Total war rules assumed the enemy would fight to extinction and had to be accommodated accordingly. Sexthala looked up with terrified eyes. Then she made us an offer. We could continue the current conflict under peacetime rules until one side was completely exhausted. Or we could negotiate a settlement that allowed both species to survive with their civilizations intact. What did your delegation choose? We chose negotiation. Immediately. Unanimously, without discussion. The reporter looked confused. Why? You were winning. Because we realized we were not fighting the human military. We were fighting human civilians who happened to be wearing uniforms. The real human war machine had never been deployed against us. Sexthala's voice grew quiet. Bishop confirmed our worst fears. Everything we had seen during the war represented maybe 10% of human military capability. The rest had been held in reserve in case someone actually threatened their home system. What happened during the rest of the negotiations? They were very straightforward after that. The humans got most of what they wanted. Territorial concessions, prisoner exchanges, reparations for civilian casualties, even guarantees about future relations between our species. The old commander finished his wine. We signed those agreements gladly. We were terrified of what might happen if we forced them to authorize total war protocols. Did you ever learn what those protocols involved? No. And I pray we never do. Bishop made one final comment as the negotiations concluded. She said that human military planners had been hoping this conflict would provide useful data about fighting galactic-level threats. Zexthala looked directly at Kira. She thanked us for being such excellent test subjects. The reporter sat in stunned silence. Finally, she found her voice. What happened after the war ended? Both sides kept the peace agreements. Trade resumed. Diplomatic relations were established. On the surface, everything returned to normal. But every military commander in the galaxy knows the truth. We did not defeat the humans. We convinced them to let us live. And they are still out there, still preparing, still developing those total war protocols. Zexthala stood up slowly. The peace has lasted 50 years, but I know it is temporary. Someday, someone will be stupid enough to threaten Earth directly, and then the galaxy will learn what human warfare really looks like. He looked down at the young reporter. When that day comes, take my advice. Do not try to fight them. Do not try to negotiate with them. Do not even acknowledge them. Just run as fast as you can in the opposite direction. Why? Because the humans we fought during the war were playing by rules designed to minimize casualties and preserve civilization. The humans who fight the next war will not be playing by any rules at all. The old commander gathered his things and prepared to leave. And that, young reporter, is why we called it victory, even though we all knew better.